There's a few ways to wireframe a dashboard. Um, what I'm going to present here is a fairly comprehensive approach. If I were to run a workshop with a client, this is what I do. So you won't have to do all of these steps every single time. Now, sometimes I'm going to do, one or two steps if I'm in a time crunch. But if you want to be comprehensive, I'm going to be showing you all the templates, printable templates that you can use to do this process. It's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour. I'm going to show you how to use them, but I'm not going to go in depth, like filling out a complete use case or case study as I go through, right? So just keep that in mind. I normally take, to go through all of this, roughly 4 hours with a client. You could do it longer. You could take longer. You could go faster. And I'm going to show you those tips as I go through it, where it takes longer and where it could be done faster. We're covering a lot. If you're familiar with the enterprise dashboard process, these are the steps that we're covering. There's sort of three main phases to the process. There's what you see in green, which is the sort of the more human design side of it, the design thinking approach, right? We're talking about user experience. We're talking to people. We're working with humans. Then we're on to the second portion, which is more of the design, right? So are you going to the actual wireframing? To do the wireframing, we need to do the first part. Otherwise, you're asking for trouble, basically. The last part we're not covering in this session, which is driving adoption, communication, right? Launch planning, all of that stuff that's super important. But we're going to be talking about the wireframing and everything to get us up to wireframing. With that in mind, stick around to the end because I'll drop into the chat the downloadable PDFs. There's 7 pages that you're going to be able to print out and use, and I'm going to be walking you through those, the printed versions, right, as I go through it. So what do you need for this, to do this? What do you need? You need a dashboard wireframe kit. If you don't have one now, it's all good. Just watch me do it, and I'll make the recording available afterwards. If you do have one, great. But the main idea is for you to watch me go through it, right? So you don't feel like you have to go through this as I'm doing it right now. This is more for what you need when you want to run this as a training or as a workshop. So the templates I'll provide, just bearing in mind, US legal size. The sticky notes. So this is important. All the templates are designed to use the sticky note that's 2.5 or 2 inches by 1.5 inches. All the templates are designed for using that. So just, various colors that you'll need just to help differentiate the sticky notes as we go through it. And finally, you'll need a pen, right? But that's it. You could do this on, different digitally, right? We're not doing that in this session. We're going to keep it hands-on, practical. And it's my preference for doing it, right? I find it much more effective. I know there's a few folks on here who don't know my background and don't know why the wireframe kit exists. So I'll just quickly go through an intro and then we're going to get into it. So back in 2012 was really when this journey started for me. I used to work as a director for user experience in a mobile application company over in this building here, in the penthouse of that building. Very nice view of Singapore. And I ended up then moving over to this building, which was the Deloitte Analytics. Well, Deloitte specifically, but Deloitte Analytics is where I ended up working. And I was head of data visualization there. And that's really where I got into this. I was running workshops for the firm on how to design dashboards. So like very specific to what we're going to be doing here. And going into that, I had a strong preference for using digital tools, digital assets, touchscreens, all the fancy things, right? But what I found over time was I couldn't bring everyone on that journey. There'd be some people in a room in a workshop that would sort of have their arms folded and they weren't really engaged. Once I transitioned to what everyone else was doing in Deloitte when they run workshops, which is sticky notes, whiteboards, getting everyone interacting, and staying away from as much digital stuff as was feasible. More people were engaged. Like we could get way more people involved in the design process. And this isn't unique to me. I just stumbled across it, but it's been around for years, right? Design thinking approach. All I did was just kind of looked at what people are doing in design thinking and figured out, okay, how do we do this with dashboards? How can we design with people something that's fairly technical, dealing with data and getting technical people to talk to non-technical people? That was probably the biggest challenge. So that's what I ended up doing for about 4 years. Moved to the US with the firm, and then ended up doing my own thing. Now, just bear in mind, this is from someone who grew up in a field in Ireland, basically, right? So, I'm not overly sophisticated or savvy in analytics, right? I didn't have a background in analytics. I needed to learn it and get into it. And the way I also found was very good was trying to keep it as low tech as possible. So when I was designing dashboards for like Formula One drivers who need to look at data in a very short amount of time, that I was able to effectively communicate with them and understand their needs so that I could design things that they could look at within, 2 seconds and understand what they need to do to improve their lap time, whatever the case may be. Obviously, as applying it to the enterprise, what we end up seeing in the enterprise is partly why we're all here is we've got a lot of dashboards and reports that are just gathering dust, that aren't being used and that aren't valuable. And the process I'm showing you today is basically how to avoid that, right? So how do you avoid all this chart junk and mess and stuff that people don't use? So here's what you're going to need, right? And the simpler this is, the better, right? So you can see there's nothing digital that we're going to be using here. It's all physical stuff. So like I said, you're going to be using these sticky notes. So just to remind you of the size, because these are the sizes that these templates are designed for. So it's 2 inch by 1.5 inch. Okay. So these are the sizes we're going to be using. We're going to be using all these templates. Again, I'll drop it into the chat at the end of the session. And you're going to be using dashboard wireframe kit. So everything's designed in these templates to use the sticky notes. We're going to be using extensive sticky notes. And then we're going to be using the cards in the kit and the charts in the kit. Right? So you're going to see everything actually fits in here. So for example, if we do a sticky note, right, for, once I write on it, right? So it fits in perfectly. So everything's by design here. Later on, you're going to see where the cards fit in. So we're going to start from the very start of this process. I'm going to walk you through it. We're going to go from dashboard strategy all the way to wireframing. When you get good at doing this, you can just jump into wireframing. That's what I do. But you can't skip this stuff if this is, your early days for doing wireframing. You have to go through these processes, these steps, right? Now, there's huge benefit to doing this as well, because especially if you're doing this with people. So if you're training people on how to wireframe, these are the steps that I use to train people. So when I'm running a training, for example, I would typically make this part of a 8-hour training. So earlier I talked about doing this in a 4-hour workshop. That's if you're actually designing a dashboard, right? I generally take 4 hours. If I'm delivering a training, I generally take 8 hours. Okay, because it takes a little bit of time to go through this process, because this is hard, right? What we're doing is hard. There's a really good reason why we end up with piles and piles of dashboards that people don't use. It's because it's hard, right? If it was easy, then we wouldn't have that problem, right? So this stuff is difficult to do. So I'm going to start with the very first template. I'm going to move some of these things out of the way. And the very first template we're using is the dashboard strategy template. Perfect. Okay, so we're lined up here. Okay, now there's a few things to look at for this. So when I'm teaching people this, we have to try and keep it simple. We could go complex, right? There's could be a lot of things you could include in this, right? So the very first activity that we end up doing in these kinds of trainings is dashboard strategy. And you'll see on all of these, we have steps, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are the stages we need to complete. Don't have to complete everything to complete total detail, but it's good to try and follow the flow. A dashboard should always have an objective, right? So let's just say high-level objective. I'm going to put in some examples as we go through this. So I'm just going to say increase sales. And hopefully you can see and actually read my writing. And so let's put that there. So you can see it fits in nicely, right? So this is something that you want to do when you're working with your stakeholders, right, to understand what is the objective and the goal. Quite often what ends up happening is the person who's building the dashboard interprets what they've been told by, via email, or someone's mentioned it to them, and they complete this themselves. Don't do that. It's very high risk, right? So it's basically inviting people to not use the dashboard because it doesn't have value to them. They don't have skin in the game. We need people to have skin in the game. Outcome. So we have some space for outcomes here. So what's an outcome? So in general, I try and have a description for what it is that you need to include here. So in this example here, we're saying these should be quantifiable and measurable outcomes. For example, increase sales by 5% for the next financial year. So we have an objective, but now we need actual measurable outcomes. So we're building a dashboard, right? A dashboard measures things. So we absolutely have to start with what are we trying to measure? And how do we know we're successful if we can't measure it? It sounds basic, right? Like it sounds very basic. Like, yeah, of course, Nick. I mean, common sense, right? We usually don't do it. Like, why don't we do it? We usually don't do it, right? And so this facilitates us to be able to have a process to do it. I like using different color sticky notes, right? So let's just take that example, right? So increase sales by what, 5%. Sales by 5% um, in the next FY. It's next financial year. Okay, so it's one thing to say increase sales by 5%, but it's like, yeah, well, what, over 100 years? Like, what is it? How are we holding ourselves accountable? So it's in general good to apply a time period, right, to any of these goals. And you don't have to have three. You can just have one. It's all good, right? So you can keep it simple. Um, Next one, persona. Who's it for? This is where it's right. This is why it's important to have the stakeholders with you, right? If you're doing this, right, it's important to be able to have the people who know who's going to be using this. Now, these are the end user personas. So since we're talking about sales, let's just say, sales managers. Okay, so there's one example. You could have more. When you have more, you increase risk. Right? So just keep that in mind. The more personas you have, the more you're trying to satisfy competing needs. So the preference is to have one persona. Not always realistic, but that's the preference. What are the high level questions they need to answer? This isn't going down into the weeds. We need to just keep this very high level. Bearing in mind, we're having this conversation right now with the stakeholders. Right. So this is something that we complete with the stakeholders. So a question would be, let's say, super high level, right? Have our sales increased? Okay, super simple. And we can have more, right? We can have more questions. I'm not going to get deep into this right now, but you could have more, right? Just want to give you a sample of how you would do this. The next, we're onto our data sources. And something that's going to be important to discuss with stakeholders early on is the data refresh rate, right? And let's just put it in for now. I'm just going to say daily. But this could be a point of conversation, obviously. Well, the data is not available. Some of it's weekly, some of it's daily, some of it's monthly, right? And then this is where you would then document your data sources. Okay, so this is kind of a little bit where the rubber hits the road. Let's just say we've got Salesforce. Okay, and we can say, okay, you want that daily? Well, yeah, the data is available in Salesforce daily, assuming the sales team is updating and inputting the data in a timely fashion. All right, let's just leave it at that for now. But you could obviously have multiple data sources, which you would then talk about, well, for each data source, is it available daily? Okay. Next is a change impact section, right? So this is usually where we don't spend any time, and we completely ignore it. What's the launch date for the dashboard? Who is it going to impact? So it's going to impact sales managers, right? Based on this. What's the technology impact? So let's think about, all right, is this being like, who's actually going to be involved in the hosting maintenance, right, of the dashboard? Are you making them aware? Is IT involved, right? And then process impact, like, so what's the impact in, like, do you have to refresh the data more often? Do you have to provide a feed to the dashboard, right? So some various things we have to keep in mind there. So that's that. Let's move on to the next template. I'll just see if any questions. Yes, Bronson, should we strive for the objective to be more specific, smart? Yeah, ideally. Yeah, totally. We should get it as good as we can. Yeah, so step two kind of wants it measurable. And we'll get into that even more in the next template as well, where we get into a little bit more detail with it. So I'm going to put that one aside and we're on to the next template. And when you're, training people on how to use this, right, they might ask, what's a stakeholder? A stakeholder is someone who's either got budget to build this dashboard, has requested the dashboard to be built, but they're not the end user, right? So it's an important distinction. These are not the sales managers that we described as the persona in the previous template. These could be the people, this could be like the head of sales. It could be the chief operating officer, head of marketing, whatever it is, right? But they're the person who's wants this dashboard built and wants to have those goals achieved. They're the one who's defined the objective. So when we look at this, we've got space for their role in the background. And just like in all of these templates, there's a little bit of a description as to what that is. So document important details about this persona, like their role, tenure, and pertinent experience. Right. So I'm not going to do that here. The next part is their challenge, our challenges. So what issues do they have? Now, it's important to note with a stakeholder, and it's noted here, right, that these challenges should be high-level challenges, right? So there's like, you know what, our data refresh is terrible. We don't get data in a timely fashion. There, nice and high level. Or they might say our existing reports are not useful to our sales team, right? Good challenges. We're not really going to take action on them. If there is something useful there that we can solve with the dashboard we're building, that's great. In general, these challenges should be broadly related to this project, right? They're not challenges just in relation to their role. We want challenges in relation to what we're doing here. So they can be related to data. They can be related to existing reports and dashboards. That's all good. Finally, their goals. So what are the goals that these people have, this stakeholder has, in relation to this project, in relation to this dashboard? And Bronson, that goes back to what you said, which is having the SMART goals, right? We want these to be as measurable as possible. I generally advise at least half of these should be measurable, because these are what's going to hold us to account with our dashboard. These are the goals that are going to be important. So let's do one. Let's take one goal, and it needs to be a little bit more specific. Like it could be the goal we had from the previous slide, but I'm going to do something a little bit more specific, right? So increase quarterly sales. So Q2R sales of product X by 5%, let's just say Q on Q, quarter on quarter. Cool. Very measurable. That is a good goal. And obviously, you can do more. So that's all good. That's that template done. Now, generally, when I'm teaching this to people, I want them to go and do the activity, of course, right? So I have them break up into pairs when they're doing these activities. And one person will play the role of the stakeholder. Another person plays the role of, the consultant, right? The person doing this, which is you, right? But when I'm training teams about this, basically break them up into pairs. So they're in breakout groups, right? So it's a small little breakout groups, and they take turns. So one person plays the role of the stakeholder, the other person's kind of doing the interview. It's like, okay, let's work on this together. And then they flip roles. So basically they're role playing. And the benefit of that is as well, they're trying to build empathy. Right? They're trying to be empathetic with the stakeholder when they're putting on the stakeholder's hat. So on to the next activity. So when I'm doing this, I generally give 15 minutes per activity, and I'll just, sometimes it might go a bit longer. It depends. 15, 20 minutes. So we'll move on to the next template. Very similar template. This is for the end user. This one's a little bit more in the weeds. We do not want to see broad, high-level goals for the end user persona. They need to be more tactical, right? So they need to be, let's find the stakeholders high level. These ones need to be more in the weeds of what's going on. So, and we say that here as well, right? So, a little bit more detail. These should be specific challenges that you fill out, and these ones should be goals that are more tactical than the actual stakeholder. So, let's do one, right? Let's pick a goal that is a little bit more tactical. Um, Now, when we're talking about the previous goal, were increase sales of product X, right? Um, let's say for a sales manager, they might be responsible for, you know, something that's going on weekly, a weekly increase. They might be concerned about their commission, right? So what things do they care about? Um, Now, so sometimes I don't want to shut that down. So I'm going to give you an example of something I might hear from a sales manager, right? So they might tell me, um, you know, double my commission, right? Okay. And that's not something I want to shut down, right? This is what personally motivates them. They're personally interested in that. And that's really what I want to be hearing from people. Now, this isn't necessarily what the business cares about, right? The stakeholder does not necessarily care about that. But if they're doubling their commission, if we can align that to going back to increasing the goal we had from the stakeholder, which is increasing quarter-on-quarter sales. Well, if this person can increase sales of product X, right? Great. They're increasing their commission as well. So they care about that. So that's important for them. And this is important to the business. So there is alignment between these two. Okay, so this is ultimately like, after doing this for years, it's like, yeah, the stakeholder cares about corporate business goals, but ultimately the end user cares about, what they do, getting up Monday morning, what's important to them. And in this example, I'm suggesting it's their commission, right? So um, there should also be other goals here. And again, when you're having people doing this in breakout groups, roughly give them 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes to go through this and take turns being the end user persona. Now, this is really important, right? But I just covered it in about 5 minutes, but it's very important. Our next template is coming up with the questions that the end user needs to be able to answer to satisfy those goals. Now, this is a key pivotal step for us. And also, when we talk about bridging the divide between technical and non-technical people, this is where that happens, right? So these questions should be things like, how much commission have I made this week so far? How many products have I sold so far this week? These are the kind of questions, right? So there's enough detail in there for a non-technical person to be able to convey it to a technical person, right? So let's say I'm like, let's pick one of these questions and just say how many units, let's say how much of product X, sorry, X did I sell this, let's just say week to date. Okay, so obviously the non-technical person, the salesperson, fully understands what that question is. But also there's enough detail in here for, let's say, the BI developer to also understand how they're going to build that in the dashboard, right? So they need to know, okay, well, what's the product? And they need to know like the time span, like the range of time. Okay, it's week to date, right? And they would know maybe their week starts on a Monday or Sunday or whatever it is, right? But there's sufficient detail here. So this is sort of where the bridging happens, right? And there'll be more of that later on. But ultimately, what we want is this populated by blue sky questions, right? So that's noted here in the template. So what is a blue sky question? This is a question without constraint. If you had all the data available, if there's no issues, there's no problem with data quality, if the actual data sources are available, and let's say there are even data sources that aren't available at all, what would you love to be able to answer? So what would the end user love to be able to answer? Now, if we can, we're not saying this is feasible. That's going to come in the next step. Feasibility is in the next step. But what we want to start here is populating a set of questions that we would like to be able to answer over time if they're valuable to the business. But we're not prioritizing yet, and we're not assessing value yet. So basically, with the end user, you would document all the questions they'd love to be able to answer. Complete blue sky approach, right? We're not limiting people at this stage. We're going to do that at the next stage. So moving on to the next template. So we got a pile of questions. Now we're going to stack up all our questions. All right, and I only have one. So I'm going to have my question stack here. So I'm going to take all the questions that I have. And we're going to go through this stage of prioritization. Again, it's all sequenced, right? So we got who's it for, right? So the goals that were the questions we're trying to answer. So these are aligned to the end user. We're going to see if each question's aligned to the goals, right? And I'm going to walk through that and I'm going to show you how to do it, right? So we're going to see what goals are they actually aligned to. And then we're going to, this is an optional step, right? I won't always do it, but if there is a challenge with like data quality and value and things like that, and I feel like we need to have that conversation, then we're going to look at scoring each of these questions. And then, does it make it into the current iteration that we're going to build? Or do we need to put it in the parking lot? Okay, and then finally, we're going to then figure out which tabs, if it's aligned to the question, right? So if there is good goal alignment, we're going to put it into these various tabs. So let's just walk through one of these, for example. All right, so let's take this question. How much of product X did I sell this week to date? So let's put it in here. And now this is where I'm going to go back to like the previous work we did on the templates earlier. So we're going to go back to the goals that we had. And we had one goal from the stakeholder was increase the quarterly sales of product X by 5%. There's tight alignment there. So we're happy with this question. It aligns to one of the goals of the stakeholders. It can align to multiple goals. In this case, we've just got one. And then we're going to check on the end user persona and one of their goals, and there isn't necessarily alignment here, is to double their commission. Right? And we can decide, well, is there alignment there or not? And if not, do we need to go back and add a goal or adjust their goals? Right? So this is bidirectional, right? So we don't necessarily always just go through the sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4 of the templates. We might need to go back and say, yeah, look, you don't actually have any goal that this is aligned to, so we need to figure out some goal here. It's not that this one's not aligned to it. There is some alignment to doubling my commission. It would do that. So for now, I'm going to say that's okay. Now we can take this question. So we still got our question, and you can score it. Now you can write it on here if you want. What I like to do is just quickly talk through this. So, the preference is to have the stakeholder, the end user, and someone from IT when you're doing this, right? So you can help understand, okay, are there data issues? Yes, no, right? And this is where we give the voice to the technical people, right? So if we feel like there's an issue with the stakeholders or the end users not really understanding the data, this is where it's really good to have this sort of conversation, right? So how much of product X did I sell this week to date, right? The IT person might say, yeah, actually that data is in Salesforce and we're good to go. No problem. How much effort is required? And in this example, we're saying there's no data issues. The level of effort's trivial because it's already there. Is there a financial or physical cost to doing this? There's not. And we're saying the business value is high, right? And it explains the rating scale up here, right? So to keep things simple, we just say 0 is the low and 2 is the high. So we don't get into a discussion on, like 7.8, yeah, or is it 7.7? It's like just keep it super simple, keep it basic at this point. Then from there we can say, yeah, this one is going to make it into our current iteration. So whereas on the last template where we had, like blue sky approach to the questions, this is where we start to take all those questions and start figuring out which ones are actually going to be useful to the business. And so we validate and vet them, prioritize them, and which ones maybe, for various reasons, might need to be put in a parking lot. Okay, so this is the sequence you're going to follow. You're going to take a pile of questions. You're going to take one question at a time, prioritize it, and determine if it's going into the current iteration or the parking lot. Okay, now this is where the magic's going to start happening. We're going to now start taking from our current iteration, and there should be a stack. In general, in my experience, I end up with a stack of like anywhere between 10, 40 to 50 questions. We're going to need to start grouping them, right? So this is where we start the initial stages of the design in our dashboard. We want to start grouping by tab where the questions are going, right? So I'm putting this one in tab 1. And let's just say you notice there's like, how do I group the questions, right? So you could group them by theme, by topic. This one, maybe it's a product tab, or maybe there's a commission tab, right? But this is where you start having the first initial ideas of where things are going to go. When I'm doing this, teaching people how to do this, I will generally ask them in their activities to come up with at least 3 questions, minimum of 3 questions, minimum of 2 goals, right? I'm not overly concerned about challenges. Reason I say that is because people love talking about challenges, and it can be a time sink. So it is good to give them some parameters for how many questions they need to have, how many challenges. Generally, I don't want them to exceed 3. Just takes up too much time, right? It's a good thing to do when you're actually building a dashboard, but when you're delivering the training, don't spend too much time on the challenges. So when you're doing this, you should have like at least 3 questions, and then they might find their group differently, right? Or they might find they're all in one tab, whatever the case is. But this is to make provision for taking a group of questions and start breaking them up by theme or by topic, right? So you're going to then take a stack of questions from a tab and move on to the next tab or the next template. And this is where we start to visualize, right? So this is you could just go here straight away. When you get good at doing this, you could just come straight to this template and teach people how to do this. You could say, okay, come up with a stack of questions, a list of questions that you need to answer. Now, bearing in mind, this is per tab. So I've taken a stack of questions from the tab 1, and I put them here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take one question at a time from this stack, and this is where the fun happens, right? So we can say, okay, we know we have some alignment to a goal, and let's just say, I'm going to take the goal from the previous one. This is to validate and vet that we're actually doing something that makes sense for the business. And now we're going to do something new. If I can answer that question, how much of product X did I sell this week to date? It's aligned to increasing sales of product X every quarter. What action am I going to take? Like, why is this important? Why do I care? So what am I going to do with this information? So one thing you might do is, well, let's say you're off target. Well, then an action I might be is, okay, if off target, spend more time. Time selling product X, for example. Okay, it's just an example. And you can have multiple actions. You could have a stack here. So why are we doing this? This is another reason why dashboards fail. because we haven't thought about the so what. Like, what are you going to do? Great, it's information on a screen. More often than not, it's information that people aren't going to do anything with, or they haven't thought about the implication of it. By doing this, we're pre-thinking the scenarios of why this might be important. Now, if we can't come up with an action, we need to ask ourselves, do we actually need to answer this question in the dashboard? And does it really matter? Do I care? Because maybe now we don't care, right? So this is really this is where all the magic is. These three things. Now it's it's taken me years to get to this, to try and keep it simple, but also what actually makes an impact for a dashboard that gets highly adopted. And if I'm trying to boil it down, it's these three things, right? These three things are what you need to make your dashboard valuable and impactful. Question: what goal is it aligned to? And what's the action? And you can have multiple, right? Because maybe, what if we're over target, right? So what are you going to do if you're over target? Are you going to maybe focus on other products? Like, okay, so the scenarios we have to think of here. So now, with this view, we're going to take these, and now we're going to start to visualize. So from this perspective, is there a KPI I need to see? Now this is picking charts and picking KPIs for most people is kind of hard, right? But now it's way easier because I have something that I'm driving towards. I'm driving towards a goal, right? So I probably need a KPI that helps me see this. How close are we to the quarterly goal of 5% increased sales in product X? So like that's an absolute go-to. So this is where you can take out your KPIs from the wireframe kit, right? And you could start here. Let's just say, I don't know, let's just I'll just pick something, right? So this one, you would then update it like, since it's a percentage, right? So you could write in a percent. And this would be like quarter Q1Q sales, right? So you'd write that in there, right? So you'd have them write it in Q1Q sales for product X, right? And put in a directional number. It doesn't have to be right. Part of the benefit of using this for your wireframing is that it's clearly not connected to data, right? So people don't get hung up on it. That's one of the issues with wireframing in the tool itself. Like, let's say you're building in Power BI and you go wireframe something, but you don't have the actual data, and people will get hung up on it, right? So it's clear that it's not that here. And maybe you want another KPI, right? So you could do that. Maybe there's the percentage increase, and maybe you have, you want to put in another KPI, right? And you put that here, and you'd write on it as well. So that's all good. That's the KPI part. You may not have a KPI, but you probably should have a KPI. Then we move on to this next stage, which is what does the user need to see? Right, so we got the key performance indicator, but now we need to start determining what charts does this end user need to see. And that's where we get onto our visualizations. So we're going to, if you have your wireframe kit handy, right, so you can start looking at that and go, okay, so here are your charts. So let's say, sales by, let's say product performance. And I'm not saying you need to pick this chart. I'm just giving an example, right? So then I'd be able to identify, if I can talk to the end user and say, that down here, we could have, increase in sales. Up here, we could have number of units, right? So a dot in the top right would be a big increase in sales and a large volume, right? So it could help them identify if product X is indeed performing well, and where there might be areas for improvement, what other products are performing well. And maybe they want to see, a trend over time. Right? You could do something like that. Right? So you could say, or, sales versus gross profit, whatever. And you could have multiples, right? So you could have multiple charts here. But this is really, this step in this process is where we can quickly cross-reference everything, right? Does this chart help realize this goal? Right? Does it help answer this question? And if it doesn't, don't put it there. It doesn't belong there. Right? So it's a very concise way to bring all of this together. And then finally, what filters would they need to see? Right? So they might need to say, well, I need to filter on product, sure. Right? Is there anything else you need to filter on? Right? So let's just say maybe they want to filter on region. Right? So maybe that's important to them. And you can again have multiple filters, right? So you can stack them here if needed. As a general guideline, we want to try and stay under 4 filters per tab. And when you're training people about this, is like, well, why is that? What's the problem? It's usually a symptom of designing for too many people, right? So we've not defined the personas well enough. And let's say you had, like, I don't know, 10 personas, right? Well, to answer all those questions for 10 personas, yeah, you probably need a lot of filters. And at some point, it's going to become a bad user experience. And so at some point, we don't want to go there. It becomes too much. Okay, so that's that part. Now we're on to the final portion, and the final template. So you're going to take each of these, right? So remember now that we've kind of answered one question, but you're going to do this for multiple questions per tab, right? So what you're going to have here is you're going to still have your question stack. You're going to take all these charts you've designed and filters. You might leave the filters there, as you go through per tab, because they should still apply to everything that you do per tab. We're going to take all these off and then move on to the next template, which is your actual dashboard layout. Now, this one, you don't have to design the exact same way as this, right? But in this one, I tried to make provision for a widescreen format. So 1080p, in which case, you don't have to have your filters on the left. I like having the filters on the left. I give them a fairly pivotal role and function in a dashboard. And KPIs at the top, I got 6. And then I got 6 charts. We can write in our tab name here. Now, obviously, you print out multiples of these if you wanted to, right? We're going to take all the questions that we answered for a specific tab, and we're going to start putting them out here. So remember all the visualizations that we just did? Now there's going to be more because I only answered for one question, right? So you would end up filling this out, right? So just for example here, just putting this in. And then you might decide, put in your filters. And the nice thing about this is then you can start thinking how all of these would interact, right? So let's say you selected a certain product. I clicked on the product. What's it going to do to the rest of the charts, right? Are you going to have it act as a filter? So if I click on that product, what does this chart look like? Well, it's just going to update to show the historical trend of sales versus gross profit for that product, right? Right, so you can kind of see how this would all operate. So it's a really efficient way to be able to do that. If I click a filter, does everything still work as it should? Right, so you wouldn't want a filter by region and then a chart by region, because it's going to end up as one bar, right? So let's say I picked Asia and I had a breakdown of charts here by region. And this is then where you can have conversations with people, right? So I can say, okay, what if we have a filter by region? I click that and then it just shows Asia here. That's one big bar. Not a great use of space. So you could say, I'm going to get rid of that. I like the chart. And then this chart just behaves as a filter, right? So that's a way you can overcome that and get around it. So that's it, folks. Took a bit longer than I'd hoped, but the idea here is that you can go from nothing. So right at the start, where you start with the the strategy for the dashboard, you use all these templates. and you end up with a set of wireframes. Now, of course, you're going to have multiples of these, right? So this is just one tab, but you're going to have multiple tabs. In general, 15 to 20 minutes per activity. When you're teaching this, as opposed to when you're actually doing it with a client. When you're doing it with a client, you need quite a bit more time. But when you're teaching it, you can generally get these done in 20 minutes. And then for the wireframing, I like to leave half an hour for people doing that. When you're teaching folks how to do it when they're trying it out themselves. Because this is probably the most, if you can call any of this fun, it's probably the most fun part for people to do. So just keep that in mind. Folks, I'm going to stop there. And if you have any questions, you can just drop them into the chat. Happy to answer. If you don't have a wireframe kit, I put them on sale on Amazon. That's going to end tonight. That sale will end tonight. So if you want to grab one, you can grab one now. If you feel like leaving a review, would really appreciate if you leave a review for the cards on Amazon. Makes a big difference for us. And yeah, any question, happy to answer any questions, folks. Type it into the chat if you want. These templates I am going to give you now. I noticed I have a couple of typos. I just made them before this. So I'll send out updated versions, but I'll give you a downloadable one right now. So bear in mind, folks, these are US legal size paper. So if you try and print on letter size, it's going to look funny. The things aren't going to fit in, right? The charts aren't going to fit in. The sticky notes aren't going to fit in. And yeah, if folks do want them, I will provide like a European version, probably A3 would be my guess, unless people have a better idea what size. Yes, okay, Bronson, you mentioned that you prefer to do this live in person. With the increase in hybrid and our remote employees, how do you handle these scenarios? Yeah, totally. We do have the digital version. So in PowerPoint, there's the digital version of the wireframe kit basically has all these templates. And so I would do it in PowerPoint and then give everyone their PowerPoint when I'm training it. So if I'm teaching people this virtually, they all get their own PowerPoint and they all do it in PowerPoint. And I would still have the breakout groups, right? If we're using Zoom, I would do that. Sometimes I'll just have them do it by themselves, right? So the activities to do it by themselves, but I find it like people kind of wander a little bit. So if I just prefer to have breakout groups if it's virtual. I mean, either way, virtual or in person, people should be grouped up. Yeah, great question. Thank you. So folks, while I'm just answering the rest, just note, I dropped that into the chat so you can download the template now. Jen, yes. Well, yes, Jen, data storytelling cards trainer. Yes. I know I owe you that. I got swamped with client projects, and the demand for delivering training on the storytelling cards. I'll do something similar to this. It won't be as formal as I wanted, Jen. You know, I had started building that and just ran out of time. I think I'll do something like this as somewhat informal. How I have been delivering the training with the storytelling cards. We had a really good one at Coca-Cola with the storytelling cards, and I'll show you kind of roughly what we did a few other ones with other clients after that, where I've kind of changed things up a little bit. So I'll do something. I'll do something maybe in like 2 weeks. That'll be similar to this. We do an hour session. Thanks, Jen. Appreciate that. Yes, and A3. Yeah, so A3 is fine. I can do A3. A3 is all good. That's a bit more space to play with than the letter size or the legal size. Yeah, awesome. Great, folks. I'll stick around just for a few more minutes. If you have any more questions, please do download the templates, and I'll email out an updated version of these templates, both with the couple of typos there I noticed I need to fix, and then A3 version as well. But I hope this was valuable. I hope you can end up using these templates and this approach to teach people how to wireframe, as well as just using it in your own process, right? So this will, I can make few guarantees in life, but I will say, if you follow this process, you're much more likely to have a successful dashboard that people will actually use they've got skin in the game. They have to get involved in this process. It doesn't allow for people just to sit back and not be involved. They have to be involved in order for this to work work well. Great, thanks, folks. Appreciate your time.